Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to the A24 project here on the Nerd Party, the only podcast to take you through the back catalogue of A24, review the latest releases, and bring you interviews with the people behind the movies. On today's show, we talk to the hand as we review the highest rated horror film of the year on Rotten Tomatoes, Talk to Me. I'm Dallas King, and with me, as always, somewhere, is my co host, Lee Hutchison. Lee, I let you in.
Yeah, thanks for letting me in. I'm looking forward to chatting about this one. I know you've been waiting nearly half a year to talk about this one, so I'm glad we're finally here.
Yeah, you finally caught up. Yeah, so today's film is Talk to Me, directed by Danny and Michael Philippou, two brothers who made their name via their Raka Raka YouTube channel, and this is their first feature film, but they do have history in the horror genre, as they did work experience as and this is directly from IMDb, a casual electrician and a production runner on a small Australian horror film from 2014 called The Babadook. So, when a group of friends discover how to conjure spirits using an embalmed hand, they become hooked on a new thrill. Until, of course, inevitably, one of them takes it too far and unleashes terrifying supernatural forces. Now, like I said, I saw this back in January at the Sundance Film Festival where it launched. But originally, there was a few select scenes were screened at Cannes back in May 2022, and that's where A24 originally picked up the film based on the quality of those two films. And it seems to be at this stage, potentially another huge win for A24. The budget for the film was 4.5 million. Not sure entirely how much A24 spent to land the film. However, it has just debuted to 10.5 million at the box office. Um, you know, perhaps, some might say it's quite a small number for a horror film. Sometimes horror films debut to like sort of 30, 40 million. However, I'd say it's a strong number given that Barbenheimer is still in full effect and has had a record second week at the box office. And also the fact, in comparison to A24's wide releases, it is actually their second highest grossing film on its opening weekend, falling just behind another horror film that they did, Hereditary, which had 13.8 million. So, Lee, I guess, I've watched this back at Sundance. I mean, what were your expectations going into this one?
I really wasn't too sure, truth be told, because we kind of spoke about it when I texted you last week. I was like, oh, I'm going to see Talk to Me this afternoon. It finally has arrived, obviously, here in the UK. And I think I'd mentioned, I was like, I've not seen a trailer for this, which people could interpret that I've done what I did with kind of Beau Was Afraid, that I was kind of trying to go into that one as blind as possible. But with this, I've literally never seen a trailer for this film at all. And I mean, I go to the cinema quite frequently, so all I kind of knew was it was about sort of like a possessed hand. And I don't think I really knew anything beyond that. So when I went in on Friday to a double bill of Talk to Me and Virgin Suicides, I was really kind of going in not knowing what to expect. And I think you had mentioned you were like, oh, I'm actually a little bit worried it's going to have that impact of like, it's really not been advertised that much. Are people really going to turn out to see this film? And, if I wasn't seeing the trailer, I don't know how many of the nearly 3/4 full at 3:50 in an afternoon on a Friday screening was, but there was
Really?
3/4 full.
Mm,
It was a really busy
wow.
turnout, and I was like slightly surprised. Like it was the first showing of the day at that time for this film, but yeah, it was like about 3/4 full. Not the biggest screen in the world, but it looked like it had a really good turnout. So my expectations were, I'm ready to be surprised. I know there's this hand. What the hand does, I have no idea, and I know Dallas loves this film, so I'm looking at that, trying to view it through your lens, and it's safe to say I watched it, and I was like, I think I turned to my partner at the end, and I was like, I can see why Dallas loved this film, which I'm really glad for.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, admittedly, I was a bit worried going into the opening weekend. Obviously, it's done very well in the States. Here in the UK, it's been released by Altitude, who, they're doing a good grassroots campaign. Obviously, it played at Sundance, London. They got interviews with the rather hyperactive directors who were very excitable at the screenings at Sundance London, and I think they did a couple of screenings, sort of preview screenings, where you got to play with a hand before going into the film. And but yeah, no, in sort of trailer wise, it's a very difficult one because I'd gone to watch other horror films recently, such as Insidious, the Red Door, which was terrible, but it did have the trailer in front of it. But obviously, it's with a horror film, it's difficult to trailer in front of, say, like a 12A Barbie screening. Although apparently they did recut the trailer to do a 12A one to hopefully play in front of some late night Barbie screenings. And the cinema I was at this week, the cinema in Aberdeen, wasn't screening the trailer in front of Oppenheimer. Um, and now, that was the only film actually which was rated a 15 on in the cinema. Everything else was sort of aimed at kids for the summer holidays. So it's difficult to get the word out there. But I think ironically, for a film about a hand, and actually for a film called Talk to Me, this is, I think, a film which will sort of live or die on sort of word of mouth, and it's sort of people sort of talking about it. It feels like the type of film which would have really benefited from one of those sort of TV commercials where it had like the sort of infrared sort of cameras sort of watching the audience at key points and stuff like that, and getting their sort of their audience reaction vox pops sort of coming out the cinema and stuff like that. So I know that at the screening I was at Sundance London, I first originally saw this film and was very impressed with it on a laptop via Sundance London, but then I got to see it at Picture House Central with a full packed crowd with Dolby Atmos, which really it's like once you hear a film in Dolby Atmos, you kind of are then kind of spoilt for any other sort of film screening where it doesn't have Dolby Atmos, because the sound design was really amped up in Dolby Atmos. There were certain, the knives plunge into things, and certain other items are gouged out of people. You can really sort of hear and feel it. Um, and the audience reacted. There was a woman next to me who literally leapt out of her seat about 4 or 5 times. I mean, how did it play with the audience that you were at for a late afternoon on a Friday?
It's one of those things. I was kind of thinking about it earlier on when I was chatting about film with someone, and we were talking about, like, she was talking about like how her friend had really kind of cries a lot at like the theater, and I was like, you know what? I go to the theater quite a bit, but like I don't think I've ever cried in a theater or a gig, but like cinema, even though it's perhaps not as immersive perhaps as, say, going along to the theater and seeing something unfold in front of you, like anything shocking, emotional, I'm more likely to feel it in a cinema. And there was quite a few moments where, like, me and my partner, as we watched it, just kind of looked away from the screen for just a moment and just kind of looked at each other and just sort of like, I think there's a certain scene in particular as someone is really hammering their head off a table and trying to eye gouge themselves, of like, oh wow, this is really gone there, or like just surprisingly not left field, but like, it's justifiable violence. Like there's this, the film certainly opens with quite a savage stabbing, and you're just kind of like, okay, if I'm reminded of something I'd remember I knew as a kid, but I'd forgotten about until recently, where I was reminded of most of like Macbeth, where that the idea that Macbeth opens with like a clash of thunder to really grab the audience's attention. And really, within about a minute or two into this film, it kind of shows you that it's kind of going to be no hold barred violence as and when it chooses to do so, and which I really particularly liked, because I don't like my violence. I'm not bothered about unnecessary violence. That kind of bores me. But like violence that is justifiable when it happens, I want to see it. I don't want to be carried away from it, especially for something that's rated 15. It's like, don't treat me like I'm a PG-13 audience member. I'm here to watch 15 rated movie, and I want to see that type of violence or gore, etc. And that was something that this film really did deliver on.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when having seen it twice already, sort of like, I guess, unrated, to discover it was a 15. I was like, oh, okay, because this is like pushing towards the edge of, I think, between a 15 and an 18 on certain things. And yes, my audience also, I mean, even I had to kind of look away at that particular moment in that scene. Um, it's just like it is a lot, and it doesn't shy away from being nasty in its horror, but it's a film which doesn't rely on jump scares. It leans into the nastiness, and like you mentioned, the sort of essentially, I guess to use an SNL term, I guess a cold open. Where you're sort of introduced to this man this young boy who's sort of with a steady cam shot going into a party. He's looking for his brother, and he pulls his brother, breaks his brother out of a room, and he's taking his brother out, and everyone's sort of filming him, going, "Oh, look at this guy! What an idiot!" And then he gets stabbed, and then the brother sort of stabs himself in the head, and that's it's like, oh crap, and like you say, you're like, oh okay, I guess sort of all bets are off in terms of what can happen in terms of the violence, and it reminded me of sort of I think like It Follows has a very similar cold open in that this girl is running away from something, and then it just cuts to a cold shot of like her twisted body lying on the beach. Her job is just beach, and it's like, okay, I have no idea what's happened, but that's creepy, and yeah, okay, I'm in to see what happens here. So I mean, what did you make of the hook essentially? Every horror film's got to have a hook. Smile was a deadly smile, which essentially Smile was just The Ring but with a deadly smile instead of a deadly videotape. But spirits, you can talk to spirits through the hand, where you're possessed, but you cannot go over 90 seconds or they'll want to stay. I mean, what did you make of the hook? And you know I mentioned this in my review, and A24 seem to have dropped the ball. Where are the ceramic hands available for purchase from the A24 shop? It seems like an open goal that they seem to have missed at this point.
You'll probably get a rotting flesh candle at some point. That'll probably be as
Oh,
close as it gets. But I think you make a good point with like the film does essentially have this kind of cold open, and I guess it kind of reminds me, I guess, of the X-Files. I mean, it was a show I loved about that supernatural and paranoid world, and I liked that. The hook works well and so on, and it's one of those ones where I must admit it maybe shows my mentality where for kind of a good period of time, because like the film doesn't play its hand too early on about like where it's going to go, what might be the spirit or the connection that really kind of pushes this film to kind of the next level of its plot. And for a bit I thought, I wonder if they're going to connect with the dead kangaroo or something like that. That it's going to be someone's going to connect with this dead kangaroo and it's going to be possessed by a kangaroo for a second. And then obviously when someone mentions like their dead mama, I was like, there we go. That's where we're going into. And I think that it works well as a connection and so on. Where like there's so much kind of horror films. Obviously I watch a pretty limited amount in the grand scheme of things, not because I'm scared, but I find the genre quite boring, or I kind of it takes a lot to impress me. But with something like this, where it is that element of it's using what the X-Files or genre should do, where it's like we're going to take a theme or an issue or a challenge for a character, and we're going to use some crazy supernatural element to tell that story. And we've saw it so much with like I guess kind of lockdown and such, like where people were isolated from their family, or particularly were losing their family and were having to rely on Zoom and mobile phone calls or digital connection to speak to people as on their final days. And what would you do if there was that opportunity that you could connect with someone that died and you never got that chance to say goodbye? And that's something we often see a lot with adults. The adults are predominantly these things, or sort of the older teens, usually they're the cannon fodder. But with this, it was interesting to explore that, where someone that's younger that perhaps hasn't a chance to kind of process their grief or deal with it, to see what selfish kind of decisions that they would make there, where that feeling is unfulfilled and so on, and how that can be, I guess, manipulated as well. We see so many young kids can be manipulated through their grief into making some terrible decisions, and I think that was a really interesting angle to take with this one.
yeah, because that the sort of character of Mia, who sort of drives the plot forward, particularly in sort of like the second two acts. she's the one that basically ruins it for everyone. Because what I found interesting to start off with was how you've got this horrific concept of, oh no, you can talk to the dead, and it seemed, I guess, given you know the youth of today, quite authentic in how they would react to something which is, completely horrific and completely unwise to be messing with, but they have turned it into a party game and for creating, viral hit videos by streaming people being possessed and stuff like that. Like, is it fake? Is it not? And then, then we've got the situation where one of the spirits appears to be that of Mia's mother who died a couple of years ago, and desperate to get some form of connection with her, that pushes a certain character past the 90 seconds, and that's when all hell breaks loose, and you've got that extremely violent scene where the spirit takes over, and then it's all about you know the door has been opened, but have we closed it? And it's about trying to you know uh, put everything back as it was, but also trying to come to terms with her grief, grief, trauma. That's what all the best films are about. The Babadook was about trauma and loss. Hereditary. That's it. And of course all the recent Halloween films. Evil, although even though Must Die
Yeah,
Tonight.
I'm imagining that Jamie Lee Curtis. Have you seen the mega cut where it's like trauma, trauma, trauma? So funny.
Grief, trauma. So yeah, they lean into it, but it's you do need that sort of connection with that character in order to drive it forward, because otherwise, yeah, it could potentially have got quite repetitive. And of course, then you sort of actually get into the sort of final third act as the spirits become stronger in the world and stuff like that. It's like, is it actually her mum though? Or is she just being manipulated by a vengeful evil spirit in order to, create a strong connection with the real world? That's what we have to ask ourselves. And it's funny you talk about the X Files, but I can actually basically see this also as like an episode of the X Files where uh, Mulder comes in one day to the office to show Scully some some TikTok videos that he's found, and thinks that they should go and investigate it or something like that. So who knows? It could have been a crossover in another world.
It would have been the first good X Files in a long, long time.
So, I mean, I know you're not a fan of the horror genre, but I mean, I guess, did it have, I guess you were shying away from the screen a couple times. So, I guess, did it deliver on the horrifying aspect? I mean, what did you make of like the sort of sound design, the sort of effects, which were sort of practical, a lot of the times as well? I mean, and what did you make of the this sort of feature debut by the Filippo brothers? I did like one of the end credits, which said that no dogs were actually kissed during the making of this film. So, which is another particular gross out moment, but for a completely different reason.
It's one of those ones like I did enjoy the film, and what I liked was that violence was pretty sparing. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think two pretty, maybe three like quite violent, visceral moments. Would that be fair to say? Sort of like the opening stabbing, the possession, and then the shower sequence.
The shower scene, and then yes, one bit involving a pair of scissors. Yes. And then the vision of hell, I guess, which sort of reminded me of sort of Event Horizon meets
Yeah,
Society.
I was thinking of Society too.
Yeah.
But,
Mhm.
Definitely a little less.
Yeah,
Yes.
used sparingly, but then I think more effective for it. And it's also a horror film which didn't really rely on jump scares too much either, which I did appreciate as well.
Yeah, I just thought that was the more interesting version and stuff. But like at this beginning, it's an interesting one of like you're sitting there thinking, would I have done that? And it's one of those ones you just kind of go with it as an audience member. Like you're not asking for
When you say
like.
what you would have done, would you have held a hand and said, "Let me"?
Well, I always wanted to do when I was younger. I always quite fancied playing with like a Ouija board. I mean, I remembered. I don't know about your school, but there was the myth of like, oh my god, I knew a person from like a town over that did the Ouija board, and they died and stuff. And you're like, oh oh my god, like could that be true and so on, and there's an element of
The
that.
days before social media when a rumor had to be spread in by word of mouth. But yeah, no, a Ouija board, which of course, if you're in Glasgow, means something completely different.
And it was one of those ones, like I liked that these people did behave like teenagers, like, and sometimes in the best and worst senses of them, there's that, you get that family sense, but just like the amount of people like filming these things and so on, like the whole kind of Snapchatting and kind of going viral with these things. And I just like that we get thrown into this world, and it's like we're not here to try and scientifically explain why it works or how these rules came around. It's just like, this is the facts, off we go, and you just sort of have to go with it, which I really liked. There's less interesting stuff when it comes to kind of the horror genre than people over explaining why certain things happen. So I particularly kind of liked that, and I just liked that after a little period of time of building up these characters, that it really gets to the emotional aspect of the kind of the story and so on. And I think that makes it a much more interesting film, and probably one that makes it something that people will recommend. I mean, I certainly wouldn't use the term kind of elevated horror, but it's just a really well done horror film and so on, and that deals with some interesting themes and makes you wonder what would you have done in that situation, because I think the element of that 90 seconds adds that ticking clock to it of like, what would you have done in that situation? You would have tried to take that few minutes, two questions takes up that time, and you can certainly debate as an audience member, was she being manipulated? I feel she was, and that makes up for something. It's a low bar for the genre in my eyes, but it was one that, even though I thought the film was good but not amazing, like the film vaulted that, and I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it succeeds because it stays on Mia's story and sort of investigating, whether or not the spirit is indeed sort of her mum. But then also, she's got this essentially, she's estranged with her dad following the death of her mum. So she's kind of been sort of brought in sort of like this adopted family, which she messes up through her, her actions. And it's about trying to help them as well. And I think the key is it focuses on that story, whereas pretty much any other horror story, like you sort of said, would have been involved in where did the hand come from? We need to investigate that. We need to find, the origin of the hand, break the curse, only to find out that, oh, the curse can't be broken. And yes, guess what? There's going to be a sequel. I mean, obviously, any good horror story, if there's potential, this has got such a good hook that yes, it does kind of set it up that yes, there could be future uh, Talk to Me too, or maybe Talk to Me Again, Talk to Me More, who knows? But yes, I think it is in a good place that, yeah, of course, obviously it will all depend on, how much money it makes. Of course, it won't be A24's first sequel. That will, of course, that will always go to the Souvenir Part 2. No one ever saw that coming, I don't think. But yeah, I think this there could be more, and I think I would be happy to see certainly what the Filippo brothers have got in their arsenal coming forward, because I think they've got a very strong voice. They clearly know the horror genre and know how to work an audience effectively. I mean, are you excited to see what's next for them?
It was one of those ones. The ending of the film, as I guess we could talk briefly about spoilers. I think we're at this stage of the
Okay,
episode.
spoiler warning goes up if you have not seen Talk to Me, which is out this weekend in the US and the UK. Go ahead, watch it, and then come back and unpause.
I kind of spent the whole film thinking, thank God this hand is on like an island in the middle of nowhere and it's never going to escape. And see, when it got to the end and so on, and it's like, I'm assuming it's to show that the hand has traveled and so on. I think it was maybe like Spanish language that was being used and so on.
I think it was Greek. I believe there's some Greek ancestry in the Filippo family, so I believe it was meant to be a Greek island. So yes, and I did actually check on the second and third viewing about which way the hand was round in terms of them shaking. I was wondering because I was thinking, could there be two hands? Because obviously it's one hand, but maybe what happened to the other guy's hand? Was it two hands? But no, it does seem to be the same hand. So clearly, someone's decided they want to get rid of that hand and send it as far away as possible. But yes, people have clearly seen the videos online and wanted to try it for themselves. So it's the kind of thing, it gets passed on and on and on to the point where yes, there can definitely be potential for a sequel.
I was almost tempted to see my reaction at the end was like, okay, it's maybe like been a few years or maybe a decade at most.
Oh yes, yeah, we don't know the time delay between
I was kind of thinking it would have been quite funny if you saw it kind of like in some sort of like weird, really, really futuristic world where not necessarily people are in jetpacks or dressed like the Jetsons, but something that could show like in like 1,000 years or 10,000, whatever, that like the hand is still going on and so on, and to almost just show this interesting parallel of like how long are people actually in limbo. And I thought that would obviously it makes it more difficult to, I suppose you could still have sequels set in the past between, but I thought that could have been quite interesting personally.
I would like to have seen an alternate ending on the DVDs where it is in a futuristic world where it's being live streamed to everyone for everyone's entertainment. Perhaps. So yeah, perhaps we'll see that. Hopefully, we don't see a lazy, easy route where someone tries to do a prequel about the origins of the hand or something. Just over-explaining everything to the point where it demystifies anything and takes all of the mystique and horror out of it. Um, yeah, we'll have to see. Um, so yeah, no, I mean, yes, talk to me. I think I saw on Letterbox it was a 3 out of 5 for you.
Yeah, it was a 3 out of 5 and so on, but like a three is.
But given that you're not a fan of the horror genre, 3 out of 5 is a glowing
I had a
recommendation.
really good time, and I mean, obviously, people saw.
You did the talk to me virgin
Yeah,
dubbing.
I did Talk to Me Virgin Suicides, which obviously we're in spoiler territory. There's definitely crossover between the two, and do you know what? The running time of those films combined was just over the length of time of Oppenheimer as well. So it's a very manageable double bill that people can do in cinemas just now with the Virgin Suicides re-release. And yeah, I think, as a final note, I think one thing that should be really celebrated is, like you mentioned, the box office earlier on, which I think is fantastic. It made, obviously, I think 10 million at the domestic box office. Obviously, it's like a smaller budget of 4.5. So,
Yeah, we'll find out after the podcast, sadly, what it's done in the UK. But hopefully some good
but do you
numbers.
know what like made was really interesting was sort of seeing that compared with the Haunted Mansion numbers as well, where I think like it was looking like it made 33 million against a budget of 150 million. And obviously why they released that just now, who knows, and so on. But it's one of those ones like that film needs to make an insane amount of money to make money back, and I think like.
Yeah, essentially the golden rule, isn't it? It's basically needs to make double once you add on your marketing. So that has to make 300 million. But I did see a very funny tweet that basically said all job interviews should come with a question: if you were releasing a film called The Haunted Mansion, when would you release it? And if you say any month other than October, you don't get the job.
Yeah, genuinely really bad decision, but at the same time, it just makes you really happy that films like this are breaking through.
I mean, Disney seem to be making a lot of bad decisions at the moment in terms of their budgeting and with their strikes situation.
And
So
when obviously, I think you mentioned it to me earlier, there's people that have complained that some A24 budgets are over the top and so on. Whereas something like this just reminds you of what they do really, really well, and it's a proven track record of success and so on. So films like this where it can drop into like such a competitive week for cinema and films and so on, and done its job. It's got its money back, and anything now after this is just sort of like pure profit, I guess. Which is a positive sign if you take that 50% kind of rule.
yeah, I mean, some people probably would have been like releasing it the week after Barbenheimer. I mean, obviously, no one expected Barbenheimer to do as well as it's done. I mean, even its second weekend, the grosses are higher than what people were predicting a month ago for its opening weekend. But it's all about counter programming. There are people who don't want to watch Barbie or Oppenheimer, or have already watched them and are looking for something different. And that's where horror is great at, is in the counter programming. And yes, before we started the podcast, I was reading an article about someone calling A24 budgets out of control because they spent 70 million on Beau is Afraid and apparently 75 million on Alex Garland's upcoming Civil War. And it's like, well, you got to look at the big picture. Like you say, they buy films for a very small amount of money and can turn a profit on those, which allows them to then invest a bit more in filmmakers like Alex Garland, Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, whatever, to give them budgets to fulfill their visions. I don't think there's any other studio or production company in the world that would have given Ari Aster 70 million to make the film that was Beau is Afraid. So it's all in the big picture. I don't think we were particularly fond of Beau is Afraid, but it's undeniably Ari Aster. It's got some incredible moments in it, and I think it's a film which people will go back to in a couple of years, and it might get repraised, and because there's some stuff going on there. But like you say, filmmaking as therapy, it's probably cheaper than what it would have cost them to work it out with a therapist.
Absolutely. Well, that'll take us into the film we'll be reviewing next week, I guess. So nice segue there, Dallas.
Indeed. So we're going to go for we're talking to me, but talking is what can get other people into trouble, especially when you talk behind someone else's back. Because next week we're going to be reviewing "You Hurt My Feelings," the latest film from Nicole Holofcener, starring Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Tobias Menzies, about a woman who has written a book and then finds out that her husband has not been particularly honest in his appraisal to her face. So we'll be diving into that one next week, and then after that we've got Underrated, the Stephen Curry documentary, and then once we get full into August, we're going to have one of the most anticipated films of the year. And if more films get delayed, potential front runner for the Oscars, it's going to be Past Lives. So stay with us. I think we're going to have an episode just about every week in August, which is A24 is back. So yeah, stay with us and stay tuned, and yeah, let us in.